So now let's look at 3 different ways in which we can change the conditional statement. The first one is the converse. The converse means that we switch the order of the hypothesis and the conclusion. In symbolic notation, we would write Q, arrow, P. In other words, what used to be our hypothesis, P, is now our conclusion, and what used to be our conclusion, Q, is now our hypothesis. The converse is equivalent to the inverse in truth value. Now, you haven't heard about the inverse yet. That will be in just a minute. But converse and inverse are equivalent in truth value. And all that really means is if the converse is true, then the inverse will always be true. And if the converse is false, then the inverse will also always be false. Let's look at a couple of examples. Translate each statement into symbolic form. We can use our own letters for that. And then write the converse for each of the conditional statements. Okay, our conditional statement states, if you play on the tennis team, then you like tennis. You play on the tennis team is our hypothesis, and you like tennis is our conclusion. Remember, the if indicates our hypothesis, the then indicates our conclusion. I'm going to use the letters E and F, just following alphabetically from before. E is our hypothesis, F is our conclusion. In other words, E, arrow, F in symbolic form. Now for our converse, our if and then will always stay in the same place. But now F, in other words, you like tennis, will become our hypothesis. And you play on the tennis team will become our conclusion. And since we are not changing our letters, F is what we indicate by you like tennis, E is you play on the tennis team. For our converse, the symbolic notation now will look like this. F, arrow, E. Remember, we just switched the order of hypothesis and conclusion. When you hear Converse, when I hear Converse, I think about the Converse sneakers. And sneakers is something that I put on because it helps me to move around. Moving things around, moving the hypothesis and the conclusion. Think about that's what happened when we talk about the converse. We move the hypothesis and the conclusion just as the Converse sneakers help us to move around. All right, let's look at our next example. If x is odd, then 2x is even. X is odd is our hypothesis. 2x is even is our conclusion. Our hypothesis I'm going to indicate by the letter G, and our conclusion by the letter H. In symbolic form, therefore, I can write G, arrow, H. For the converse, I'm going to switch around H and G. H is now our hypothesis. 2x is even. And the conclusion is x is odd. Now mind you that we are only doing this now to indicate how to change from a conditional to a converse. We're not saying anything about the converse being true at this point, okay? You can think about it, but don't worry about it too much. More importantly, our symbolic notation is now H arrow G. Equivalent statements. We have already talked about the truth value, and equivalent statements are statements that have the same truth value. As we had already said, the converse and the inverse have the same truth value, and there's another pair, the conditional and the contrapositive, also have the same truth value. Now note, and remember the example before the last one, the conditional and the converse do actually not have the same true value always. All right, so now let's try and find out what the inverse and the contrapositive actually are. First, I want you to think about the words negate, negative, or negation. And I want you to take the margin on the left side of your notes and write down what that means to you. And also you can make a prediction about what you think it will mean in a sentence and in the context that we are discussing here. Okay, negation. Negation really means the opposite of something else. It also means that we can put in the word not into a sentence, but equally we can take out the word not in a sentence where it's already in, and both actions will negate the previous statement. In symbolic notation, we write negation by a little squiggly line before the letter that is our hypothesis or our conclusion. Okay, let's look at these examples. Negate these statements. You like to dance. The negation of that would be you do not like to dance. The not negates the original statement. And equally, if you say you don't eat spinach, what's the negation of the statement you don't eat spinach? You eat spinach. So now we are taking out the not and also negating the meaning of the original statement. And with that being said, we're now ready to talk about the inverse. The inverse negates the hypothesis and the conclusion of our conditional statement. In symbolic notation, we use the squiggly line and we write not P, arrow, not Q. The inverse, as we have stated above, is equivalent to the converse in terms of its truth value. Let's look at this example. Translate the statement into symbolic form and then write the inverse for the conditional statement. All right. If it is 6 p.m., then it is time for dinner. It is 6 p.m. is our hypothesis. It is time for dinner is our conclusion. Remember, our if and then indicate to us which part is hypothesis, which part is conclusion. I'm going to use G and H now for our letters, and therefore in symbolic notation, the conditional statement can be written like this: G arrow H. Our if and our then will stay always in their place. And now all we do is we take our hypothesis, negate it, and then we take our conclusion and negate it. If it is not not 6 p.m., then it is not time for dinner. And using our squiggly line in inverse notation, in symbolic notation, excuse me, rewrite the inverse: not G arrow, not H. To remember what the inverse does, maybe it'll help if you think about the N and think about no or negation. Inverse negates both hypotheses and conclusion. And now let's get ready for our last modification of the conditional statement, the contrapositive. The contrapositive negates the hypothesis and the conclusion of the converse. Oh boy, sounds very complicated, but believe me, it's not. Essentially, what we're talking about here is, in symbolic notation, we would write not Q arrow, not P. In other words, if you think back to our original conditional statement, P arrow Q, we are doing two things. We're flipping the letters and we are negating everything. Another way of thinking about it, maybe the contrapositive is a very complicated name, and it's the whole thing. Everything you can think of, you do in the contrapositive. You flip the statements around and you negate everything. The law of the contrapositive, again, talks about the truth value, and what it says is that the contrapositive, and this is kind of maybe amazing because we're doing so many things, changing these things around, but ultimately the contrapositive has the same truth value as the conditional. It's equivalent to the conditional, in other words, a very initial statement. And also here we have a couple of examples. Translate the statement into symbolic form once again, and then we're going to write the converse and the contrapositive. Our conditional statement: if you visited Sterling, then you were in Virginia. Our hypothesis is you visited Sterling. Our conclusion is you were in Virginia. In symbolic notation, I'm going to use the letters N and R, N arrow R. Our Converse, therefore, remember our Converse sneakers, we move stuff around, okay? So we're going to write, if you were in Virginia, I'm using the state abbreviation, then you visited Sterling. Let's use our symbolic notation. You were in Virginia is R. So R comes first, R, arrow, N. We flipped, we moved the hypothesis and the conclusion. And now, remember the contrapositive negates everything about the converse. That's why we did the converse in the first place, to help us out here. If you were not in Virginia, then you did not visit Sterling. In symbolic notation, therefore, we're going to write not R, arrow, not N. And let's think about the truth value for a minute. The conditional statement said, if you visited Sterling, then you were in Virginia. Now, I am talking about the city of Sterling, Virginia, not some other city of Sterling. And if you were in that city, then you were clearly in Virginia. So this is true. On the other hand, the converse, if you were in Virginia, then you visited Sterling, doesn't have to be true. I'm in Leesburg right now, and so I'm not in Sterling, and I'm still in Virginia. So the converse, if we create a converse from a conditional, that very often ends up being false. But now we go to the contrapositive, and we say, if you were not in Virginia, then you did not visit Sterling. Well, if you weren't in the state of Virginia, how could you possibly have visited the city of Sterling, Virginia? And that tells us that the contrapositive is also true. So, as we said above, in the law of the contrapositive is equivalent to the conditional in terms of its truth value. That's what we wanted to find out. This concludes today's lesson. For your summary, in your summary section, what I want you to do is I want you to take a conditional statement, just the one right there, B, arrow, E, and I want you to translate it into, or change it into a converse statement, into an inverse statement, and into a contrapositive statement using symbolic notation, nothing else. That's your summary for today's lesson, and I will see you in class.